Welcome to the Be on the Move podcast, hosted by Andrew Ronchetto. Through thoughtful conversations, we explore how innovation fuels growth for humanity, uncovering the stories and ideas that shape lasting impact. And now your host, Andrew Ronchetto.
Hey everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Be on the Move. If you've been listening in, you know this is where we're exploring these moments in life, different mindsets, movements that really help empower human potential. And today I'm excited because I've got Dr. John Hillen with me. And why that name might resonate with you is probably because you might have heard it come up through a variety of different ways. He's been in business, he's been in the military, he's been in academia, he's also been in the government, and he was a former assistant secretary of state. So not only being assistant secretary of state and an award-winning professor, but also a seasoned CEO, he brings just a decades or multiple decades for that matter of leadership experience to this podcast. And I'm really excited to welcome John to the episode, and I'm happy to have you here.
Yeah, great to be with you, Andrew.
You know, I gotta maybe base it and like ground folks a little bit in here because I think it really relates to the essence of what we're trying to do, especially with everything going on today. People are burnt out, people are stressed out, they feel or maybe blame it on others, but we know we're a part of that conversation, we're a part of the answer of that. And I think leaders and managers feel the stress of that on themselves, like the weight on their shoulders for their organizations, for their teams. But I'm going to kind of boil it down a little and say, the fact is strategic thinking is hard, and I don't know that we do enough of it these days. I don't know what you think about that, but I'm going to kick it off from there because I feel like there's something there to begin with.
Yeah, it really is, and it's unnatural for most people, Andrew. Strategic
I
thinking
agree.
is unnatural. And this is not just me saying, I'm a strategy professor. I've got a new book out about strategic thinking. This is not just me. This is what the research shows. In my new book, I cite this one study of hundreds of executives. And what the researchers looked at is what is the way they explain their decision making? What's the rationale for their decision making? And they found that only 4% of executives naturally use a strategic rationale. So what does that look like if you run into it? If you say to me, hey, John, why do I have to get this done by the end of the month? Most answers you get in a standard work setting would be from either an achiever who would say, well, Andrew, it's due at the end of the month. Like, why are we even having a discussion? That's why you need to get it done. It's always been due at the end of the month, right? Short-term achievement. That's all the logic you need. The second biggest group of executives are experts. They'll say, look, Andrew, it's got to be done by the end of the month because I need the data. And once I have the data, I can make decisions. Okay, that's 2/3 of the executive population. 4% of the executive population will explain it to you this way. Say, Andrew, if you get it to me by the end of the month, I'll have information that'll allow me to put us on a potentially different trajectory for the quarter. And if we achieve something different in that quarter, we might be able to reposition the whole organization for next year. And if we're repositioned there for next year, we might be able to change the whole velocity on our 3-year plan. And so they're explaining to you the rationale for your end of month assignment in a series of chess moves. That's thinking strategically. And I spent a lot of time in the book saying, how do you know it when you bump into it? What are the Las Vegas tells for a strategic mind? And that's one of them. Thinking long-term and stringing together moves to ultimately be in a better place in the future.
Well, first off, I don't know if this is a good or bad thing, but I have not experienced that in my 15 plus years of consulting. And I felt like I've been in some pretty strategic projects from M&A to digital transformation, you name it. And, when we talk about it, I get where you're coming from because what you did for me in that moment, and I'm surprised it's only 4% because I feel like it needs to be bumped up. But then you think about it, it's like, maybe not so much, is you brought me along for the ride.
Right.
You brought me along to attach why what I'm doing matters.
Right.
And in a lot of ways, this is what we struggle with today. Not just in tying it to strategy and having critical strategic thinking, but just being able to align our own personal purpose to the organization's principles and practices and priorities. Like,
Yeah,
feels like a big disconnect.
it really is. And purpose and direction are really the things that attach people to strategy, and they need to go together because ultimately strategy is about the future. Like, where are we going to be in the future? And how do we make that a position of greater advantage than today's position? Right? That's the essence. Now I'm giving you the high octane pure version, right? So,
Absolutely.
so
If we had a lot of
you
time,
may
we would
see,
go deep.
yeah, you may see little elements of this in people's thinking. But one of the reasons why people fail to think strategically is sometimes they just misunderstand what strategy is. I was doing an offsite with a public company, and one of the guys, I don't even know why we need this offsite. We have a strategy. I said, oh, good. This will save me some time. Uh, Tell me, what's your strategy? He said, we're going to raise the stock price by 8% next year. I said, well, that's a goal. Maybe it's a good goal. Maybe it's a bad goal. I don't know. I just got here. It's not a strategy. He said, what do you mean it's not a strategy? I said, it's a goal. And someone else said, well, we aim to be the leading provider of such and such. I said, that's an aspiration. It's a vision. Sounds very inspirational. It's not a strategy. And then, someone else said, well, we stand for innovation and integrity and agility. I said, those are great values, but they're not a strategy. And then I had to lay out, what is a strategy? It's a series of interconnected moves, very much informed by goals and visions and missions and values. But it's a series of interconnected moves that are sequenced. The dependencies are all worked out, and they move the entire organization to a place of better advantage, to a position of better advantage in the future. It's a game plan. It's a blueprint for institutional movement. And so I think once people get their heads around that, they say, okay, now I can understand what does it even mean to talk strategically and think strategically. I'm thinking about the long term, not the short term. I'm looking at a kind of big picture rather than just a little narrow soda straw view of the world. I'm connecting things, like I'm putting things together. I'm seeing how ecosystems impact on each other in this future journey rather than breaking problems down like an analyst or a problem solver. And it turns out, Andrew, and I talk about the brain science in the book, you're literally using a different part of your brain. It's a right brain, creative, art of the possible, future oriented activity, as opposed
Interesting.
to what most of us use most of our workday because we're focused on task accomplishment. And that's the processing, hardcore, get stuff done part of your brain, which is mostly left brain activity. But just like, I have a trainer, and in the gym, the trainer can show me how to activate a muscle and then show me what machine to go to use it. Same thing. What I try to show in the book is everybody's got a strategic thinking muscle. You just need to know what it feels like when it's activated. And then there's machines in the gym you can go to work it out on.
Yeah, I love that analogy because I think about it in the sense of, it is a big muscle and it is a muscle to play. And I used to make this comment to folks, it is hard for you to mindset switch in any given day. If you're truly thinking strategic and in the way you were just describing it, which I totally relate with, it is hard to go from that, I'm going to say right brain thinking, tying it all in, to the left side, very analytical, tactical, in the moment kind of thinking,
Mm,
and go back and forth day to day. I don't feel like you get your best work at all when you're in a role or a position where that is happening so frequently that that context switching actually has a negative effect, so to say, on the true output that you're trying to get at.
yeah. And so for that reason, Andrew, I like to see it done in teams, right? One team's got
Okay.
what sailors call a weather eye on the horizon, right? And the other team's like running around the ship, stoking the boilers, plugging the leaks,
Yep.
bailing out the stuff, tending to the whatever happens on a ship, right?
Red light flashing.
Yeah, yeah. But there's someone looking at the horizon, checking the weather for the next week, plotting the wave strength, all that stuff. So I think I'm betraying the fact I was a former Army officer and paratrooper rather than a Navy guy, right? Because my Navy analogy is pretty clumsy.
Your
But
former colleagues are gonna be looking at you like, "Who
oh,
is
I
this
know
guy?"
I'm gonna get a heap from my Navy friends when they hear this. But you get where I'm going with that. So teams,
I do.
you've probably done or seen something like Strength Finders, one of these kinds of things. But you remember, these four categories of Strength Finders. Everybody's stronger in certain areas than others, and it doesn't mean you can't be good in other. It's just this is your natural moves. So a lot of my natural moves, two of my top 5 strengths are in the surprise, surprise, the strategy category. I'm a strategy professor, right? So, what does that mean? That means I want to have on my team a couple of people who have the commensurate, complementary strengths in execution because they're going to be more short-term focused. They're going to be getting stuff done. I'm going to be thinking about the future and so on. So I like to see teams organize themselves so that they have a good combination of management, leadership, strategic, interpersonal, conceptual skills, the whole range of executive competencies, not represented in one person, because that's like a super person, super leader,
Well, I
but
was gonna
rather
say then everything
represented
falls
in a
flat.
team. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. If you had it that in that one person, it almost kind of lose it because they win the lottery. That's the one we always use. Got to use the positive side of it rather than the negative side. They win the lottery, and then you're kind of out of luck, so to say, because it all kind of goes with them, and you need that
Right.
in that team orientation. Absolutely. But I gotta imagine, like, I mean, so it sounds simple to like create these teams, but this isn't new stuff, so to say. I don't think we're like preaching, a brand new concept in that regards, but I feel like a lot of blind spots still kind of materialize because even though it's like almost common sense to say, yeah, you want to have a mix of all of this, and we sometimes do and sometimes don't. Like we don't always kind of address it when we do recognize that it's a problem. And
Yeah.
I'm sure that's at one aspect of your blind spot, but I'm sure there's some others that really kind of create this, okay, anti force, so to say, in terms of thinking strategically.
Yeah, let me give you 2. I can give you 3 if you have time. I mean, this could be a whole, you put blind spots on your bingo card and see how many you have. I think I've covered them all in my career. So, blind spot number 1 is people are so focused on task accomplishment that they fail to that they see problems as things that went wrong and need to be solved rather than opportunities to change for the future. So what do I mean by that? You have a standard business problem. Let's say one of your product lines is fading in sales. The usual response of organizations is get everyone involved with that product line into a room, start loading up guns for the circular firing squad, and like drill down. Today we're going to drill down.
Yep.
It's like an old George Carlin routine, right? Problem solvers drill down. Strategists think about a better future, right? It's like that old baseball, football, George Carlin comedy routine. But that's what we do. And instead, take that problem and say, this is simply a series of different options about the future. So we have a product line declining in sales. Do we use the same product and move it to a different geography, different market, different set of customers? Do we enhance that product and sell it back to the same customers? Do we look for a complementary set of things that when twinned with that product offer a different value proposition? Maybe we'll go out into the market and do some M&A, or maybe we'll put this in like a BCG matrix and this thing's failing. Why should let's divest this product. But if you just simply recast the exact same problem as a set of different paths to the future, it opens up this art of the possible future orientation in your mind instead of solving today's problems that's based on yesterday's ills and yesterday's data. And it totally casts your mind forward. I mean, it's still the same problem. Right?
Mhm.
It's not some magic pixie dust that makes the problem go away. But all of a sudden your language is different. Instead of saying, no, that's not going to work, Bob, what you hear is, interesting, Bob, what would have to be true for that idea to work? It's a different kind of conversation in the room where everybody's thinking about this art of the possible. There's a little creativity applied to it. And so that's blind spot number 1. I'll just call it attitude.
All right.
Right? Attitude and framing an issue. Blind spot number 2 is people confuse strategic planning with strategic thinking. I get a lot of calls in September. They're like, "Hey, you're the strategy guy, right?" Yes, it's a strategy guy. Okay. And they're like, "Well, we're having our annual strategy offsite." I'm like, "Why? Because it's October." And they're like, "Yeah, it's October." I said, "What are you doing in October?" "Well, we got to do the budget for next year and everything else." I'm like, "Oh, it's your annual budget drill." They're like, "Well, we do the budget." And I'm like, "Do you always only do your strategy in October?" "That's the time, man. That's the time when we do it." And so people disguise strategic thinking as their annual budget drill. And because it's your budget, it's usually based on a performance baseline of known data from last year, okay, which naturally drags your mind backwards. Strategy is about making intelligent bets about the future. It's situation dependent, it's ambiguous. You have to wrestle with what the future looks like, all these things that are shaping the environment in which you operate. So I tell people, so they say, well, when should we redo our strategy if we want to disconnect it from the annual budget drill? I said, any time something important changes in the environment in which you operate, such that it might upend your current strategy. There's a recession. There's a huge change in technology. There's a regulatory change. There's something, right, that all of a sudden changes something significant.
Yep.
And so, those are two blind spots I see organizations have all the time. Why? Because it's human nature, right? It's just human nature to want to do corporate programming and call it strategic thinking, or to drill down and solve problems as opposed to see them as different alternative pathways to the future.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, something that came to mind, like as you were talking about it for me, is when we talk about risk. We talk about risk purely from a negative perspective. What am I going to lose if something materializes?
Yeah,
But rarely do we talk about the opportunity like you're talking about.
yeah,
And attitude or standard, I'm not gonna even call it standardization within organizations. I mean, I wish it was only October, but I've seen with so many clients, it's actually, just about May coming up here. And
right.
everybody's like, all right, we're starting the annual budget cycle. And I'm like, really? Like nothing's going to change for the next 8 months. Like
Yeah,
we're sure of that. Like, well, we've
right.
already committed, 95% of the money
That's right.
from last year. And I'm like,
That's right.
so you're
That's right.
going to spend 8 months talking about the last 5%?
That's right. That's right. We really have held the future hostage to our plan, and the future better comply.
As if humans weren't involved. And I
Right.
think that's a part that I kind of bring into this is like we before we even get into these conversations around like strategic thinking and whatnot, it's not strategic because you talk about from a past perspective, but I almost like as I was thinking about it, the thing I went to immediately is to say, well, I have a target I have to hit and I already know that I'm going to miss it.
Mm,
And instead of thinking, and that creates a fear, So instead of thinking outside of the box about, like you were talking about, expanding and looking at different opportunities, different markets, in the example you were given, to look at the problem differently and come up with different answers of how to pursue it, we immediately go down to say, well, let me put a spreadsheet together and bullet out how I can get to the number and the
right.
performance. Like we
Right.
rarely reevaluate that in a, I hate to say it cheesingly here on the show, a strategic way.
Yeah. 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 And it's simply counting on known data can often be the enemy of good strategic thinking, because it's
Sure.
necessarily about the past or the present. Most organizations I've worked with that really want to rely on hard data to animate their strategic planning and strategic thinking end up with what I'll call a plan for very modest improvement. As Now, I'm not saying every strategy should be some massively transformational thing. I think
I get
sometimes
that.
little moves can be really potent, right? If
Yep.
the essence is to put your organization in a position of greater advantage in the future, a future which is changing every day, right? Then sometimes a little move can be quite powerful. But on the other hand, always using the baseline, freeing up 5% in your example to possibly do something different is really a recipe for modest improvement as best, and generally tends to just constrict the strategic mindset.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think about this in the context of the human element a lot.
Mm,
Because like, I brought up performance a moment ago, but when you look at the equation for performance, the one variable that's not included in it is the human element.
right.
Who's in the room having the conversation with you, but also then what's the makeup of your team, the culture, how stressed out is the team, like, and these are all things that everybody's talking about these days. We've got to fix it, and there are a lot of different, I'm going to say tactical, can I say tactical strategies to fix
Right.
the problem.
Right.
But what I would argue is, and love to get your thoughts on this, for those leaders listening out there, it's kind of just whitewashed traditional approaches to try to solve a new complex thing that we're experiencing.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you put your finger on, what I was going to say was the third blind spot, which is that the common foibles of executing a strategy are all based on human behavior. Um, so we track this. I cite, in every single chapter in the book, and I don't make it super simple, but I have a big whiteboard summary, and then I have all the reference points, all like an annotated bibliography. You want to go further and deeper, here's the studies, here's everything. And one of the studies I cite in the chapter on turning a strategic plan into execution tracked hundreds of strategies and how much they delivered out of what they promised. And they found that on average, organizations got about 63% of what their strategy had promised to deliver to them. So where'd the 37% leak out?
I was
Well, they
going to say, I
tracked it.
thought it was worse.
Yeah, yeah, you're pretty optimistic now, 63%. So where did 37% go? 6.9% leaked out because they failed to resource the new part of the strategy. 5.8% leaked out because bureaucratic silos developed that were threatened by the change and refused to talk to each other. Another 4.3% leaked out because everybody was confused about who had the information rights and the decision-making authority. 3.5% because it was not communicated clearly, and so on. And when you look across, you're like, oh my gosh, you could read a short story by Chekhov and know all this stuff, right? This is just the human story. Human beings have
Yeah.
always been working together trying to accomplish stuff. And this is the stuff they do to themselves in organizations, right? But if you can track it and you can frame it out, and I give like all these frameworks that people can work with, then you can get out ahead of it and get solutions to it. So it really is. That's another blind spot, is the common foibles of the human enterprise, which the better managers and leaders try to front run and get out in front of and not let debilitate an organization, are the same things that'll deprive a strategy of its intended impact.
No, absolutely. And what I see in it too, and I'm going to say bringing it into the tactical side of it, is in many ways it's leaders listening.
Yeah.
And and I'm going to say also then not getting stuck by analysis paralysis, so to say,
Yeah.
where by the time it gets to their level, whatever that data is, it's been massaged so many times that you're not even really clear on what the starting point was to the point that was being made when they were having the conversation. And I
Yeah.
think those two elements fundamentally create a massive disconnect in terms of what we talked about right at the beginning of aligning an individual's purpose and understanding and appreciation for the strategic conversation to all of the steps that can be applied,
Yeah.
because I'm able to almost line it up.
Yeah. I must say in the book that every good strategic thinker must have a bias towards action a dozen times, because one of the objections that strategists often hear from normal people is that's too theoretical. Like, I don't have time to sit around in an offsite and stroke my chin and think big thoughts about the future. Mr. Guy with too many degrees. I work for a living around here. This is all theoretical nonsense. And I say, don't do strategy offsite. Do it every day. They're like, what do you mean do it every day? I'm like, it's like hygiene. Do you only take a shower when you're on vacation, right? Hygiene every day. So what does that mean? In every meeting you're in, let's say you have a project management meeting. At the end of the meeting, have a strategy moment. In the way some company, I was on the board of a nuclear company. We had a safety moment to start every meeting. As a cultural signal about
Yep.
really important in a nuclear company.
Yep.
So have a strategy moment at the end of every meeting. Okay, we just decided that the new release is rolling out in 10 days, no matter what. We'll fix it on the fly if it's not perfect, and go around the room and say, this decision to roll out the new release in 10 days, how does it feed our long-term goals and advance the organization in terms of the strategy we've enunciated. And you may not get anything new out of that. You're not looking for some blinding insight. It just reminds everybody that they're in the business of everything they do contributing to where the whole ship is going, right? So
Yep.
I think part of this challenge is getting people to think of strategy as not something you do only on special occasions in the occasional offsite, but you need to integrate it into your everyday thinking and activity.
Well, and I think if you do that, there's a couple of things that come from it. Because I've done that in some of my projects. Like when you're, in a high stress situation, you're taking something that's, and in my case, normally 24 months and doing it in 10 months. That has happened. There's a lot of things that need to go right.
Right.
But if you're not, I'm going to say, singing from the same tune. It doesn't mean everybody is double checking everybody else's work because you wouldn't have time for that. But understanding how their lane, I'm not going to say silo because I think that could give the negative connotation, but their
Right.
lane directly associated or tangential to yours is impacted because of decisions and moves you're making.
Right.
Car passing over the median and whatnot. But the reason why I bring that up and why I think about it in the context you're talking about is it doesn't even necessarily mean at that point you are being strategic, but you're not, I'm going to say, fully flipping on that mode. You're still thinking very tactical in some ways. You're like, okay, we made decision X. What are all the cascading impacts that I need to think about? Because I agree with decision X.
Right. Right.
But and maybe I figure it out in the moment like you're talking about, or maybe I'll come back in the next meeting, or maybe in between the meetings. It doesn't even have to be meeting to meeting. I'll be like, an aha moment that
Right.
it comes up and it says, hey, we should do this. And creating a culture where that can happen, that
Right.
level of engagement, that level of listening, that level of thinking and process, I think is what's missing a lot these days, to your
Yeah.
point.
Yeah, and you just betrayed a strategic mind, right? You give away that's the tell in Vegas if you're thinking strategically. What could be the future implications of this decision, right? And how might they impact on other things? Strategists think a lot about dependencies. For instance, I was working with a company and we came up with a great strategy, a list of 10 things we prioritize and we're going to do to make this strategy happen. And the second thing was win this big new contract. And the eighth thing was implement a financial management system that was a necessary qualification to bid on that big contract. I was like, well, you better move 8 ahead of 2 because there's a dependency in there. And they were like, yeah, oh, right. So redo. So that's very common. But what were we doing in that room? We were having a strategic dialogue, right? I found out, and this is why I call the book the strategy dialogues, and all the lessons are done in a dialogic way. In fact, Patrick Lencioni, the Five Dysfunctions of a Team author, blurbed the book because he loved that approach because he's like, this is the way people talk and learn. I'm like, yes, I've had hundreds of these conversations. So the better organizations simply, and you even structured your question as people going back and forth, the better organizations simply have this conversation. They have this dialogue. And it's not like every conversation, every dialogue results in a plan to put, a colony on Mars. That's
Exactly.
not the goal. The goal is organizations that talk this way are just healthier and they get more stuff done because they're having a strategic dialogue in the course of their normal work.
Yeah, absolutely. And the last thing it kind of like brought up from my mind in here is what that means for the individual. Because at the end of the day, so to say, to use that term, it's going to come back and say, if I can have that conversation, one, I feel like I'm contributing something much
Right.
larger than me.
Right.
And a lot of people, whether that is because they want to be, the next executive, or they just want to do a good job in their role. For them, it just creates those endorphins they need in that
Yeah.
moment to feel purposeful in the work that they're doing.
Yeah.
Um,
I think that's a huge benefit. I think the work of Daniel Pink and others have shown that, mastery and purpose are two of the biggest motivators for people, especially in an information age economy. That's really important. The other thing I would know is just everybody needs this. we succeed in the early part of our career, no matter what field you're in, with our technical and tactical skills, our
Yep.
ability to get stuff done. As soon as you're put in charge of something or somebody, the key to your success are your strategic and interpersonal skills, not your technical and tactical
It's
skills.
your team.
Yeah. So even a CTO of a company doesn't write a line of code or do network or system design or anything like that. They oversee lots and lots of people and lots of processes that are technology in their orientation. And their success is not based on what a master technologist they are, but their strategic and interpersonal skills in the technology field. So I think everybody's on this same journey to where your strategic and interpersonal is going to determine your success, sometimes early in your career, but definitely for the second half of it. So why not start learning it now? Start exercising this muscle.
No, that's fantastic. And everybody here heard it from John directly of like what that means. And I relate to it because when I kind of go in, and especially when I was a consultant doing this a lot, I'd come in and say, look, I could code. Like I can be there alongside you. It doesn't mean I'm going to. I think you're going to be a lot faster at it than I am. But if you got a problem, let's figure it out. Like, why? Let's not have you just spin the drain, so to say, trying to get it in, into the structure that we said it needed to be, only to realize that if we would have just evolved it, it would have made it a lot better.
Right.
Like helping build that type of culture within an organization is so fundamentally important because it's helping everybody. It's helping you figure out your interpersonal skills, like where do you draw the lines, but it's also helping them learn and grow. Like when is the point that I ask for help? It's not at the beginning, and it's not after I've circled the drain, so to say.
Yeah.
It's somewhere in the middle and figuring that out.
Exactly.
Well, John, I really appreciate this, and I love how we've tied it in. And I've been looking at your book and everything, and I find it fantastic, just in the way you structure things. I absolutely love that here. Um, I'm curious if there's anything, because we could go deep, like you said, but I'm
Sure.
curious just with some of the high level items that we've been talking about here and how it relates to our interpersonal skills, to leadership, to our individual growth and whatnot. If there's anything else or a tidbit in there you want to throw out to folks that would be helpful, or just bring it all together.
Yeah, no, I'd say, and sometimes I've written a couple of books, about leadership, about strategy, about other things, and sometimes, even if you're the author and the so-called expert, the meta lesson only emerges after you're done with the book, and it kind of comes up at the end as you put down your pen, having written the last of a couple 100,000 words. A ghost rises off the page and says, "This is what your book's really about." And that happened in this too. The Uber theme, the meta theme of the book, the strategy dialogues, is strategy is a way to think, not a what to think. Now, I outline in there in detail with 30 or 40 illustrated frameworks and all the references, the strategic management process and the strategic thinking thought process. So it's very like boom, boom, boom. And I try to keep it very simple. But at the end of the day, that's not a formula like there is in finance or operations management or accounting or supply chain or engineering or something like that, right? So if you're looking for a perfect answer that everybody should get, having inputted the right data, that's not strategy. It's a way to think, not a what to think. It frustrates my students because I teach the core strategy course in an MBA program when I tell them there's no right answer to the problem I'm about to give you. There's only the answer you give and how well you support it with good strategic concepts and good analysis and some data. I mean, it's not divorced of data, right? Um, but and you're not going to all arrive at the same answer. And they're like, "Who's right?" And I'm like, "That's not the question." You know? So yeah.
That's what they've been taught
So
all these years. Like there
yeah,
is a right answer.
right, exactly. I wanted the right answer. It's a number. It's a way to think, not a what to think. Commit to the process. It's not a brilliant idea generation game where you have a contest to see who has the best crazy idea. Commit to the process, and you'll get to really interesting ideas at the end. You'll be able to evaluate the differences between them and then choose a path and go. And organizations that do that turn out fine. So I think it's a doable do for every large, small organizations, governmental, non-governmental, business. Commit to the process, commit to the way of thinking, and then make a decision and stick with it.
I absolutely love that, because I'll leave it as one other analogy to all that. I talk to people, like, one of the ways I looked at a lot of the complex work I did is I see it as a 6-dimensional game of chess where every side can play each other. And they're like, well, then there's infinite possibilities. I'm like, yes, but there is a moment right now where we have, to your point, a whole bunch of data that we can make decisions off on. And so we're going to make decisions today, because we could just wait to make decisions until the next thing plays out. But the point being is we need to continue to move. And when we get more data in, we'll think and readjust if we need to, or we'll keep going like that. I think a little bit to your point of looking at it, not getting stuck, but looking at just the fact that sometimes you have data, sometimes it's intuition or instinct. But the point is the answer will reveal itself over time, and it's not going to be the same for everybody.
Right.
And I think that is a fundamental lesson everybody should take away from this conversation today. I absolutely loved it, John. And I want to appreciate and thank you for your time on the podcast here, Beyond the Move, because it's really all about growth for folks. It's about taking those micro steps and being intentional about it. And I think for all those managers and those leaders out there really listening to what you shared, it should help you fundamentally start to rethink how you can engage with your teams and help develop your organization to be a stronger, more resilient organization and team for the future. So thank you so much. And thank you to everybody for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Beyond the Move. Don't forget to follow us, rate the show, and share with others. If you're ready to dive deeper, visit us at beyondplatform.com. Catch you next time.